December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The morphine syrette made a small clicking sound as it was pressed against a soldier's thigh, barely audible over the distant thunder of artillery and the closer, more terrible sounds of men crying out in pain. In the dim light of a field hospital tent erected behind American lines, a nurse's hands moved with practiced efficiency, her fingers numb from cold, despite the wool gloves with the fingertips cut away. The tent canvas rippled and snapped in the winter wind, and through the gaps, snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that seemed to absorb sound, muffling everything except the immediate suffering. On a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates and planks, a young infantryman from Ohio lay with his leg shattered by shrapnel, his face gray with shock, his breath coming in shallow gasps that sent small clouds of vapor into the frigid air. The nurse leaned close, speaking words he probably couldn't hear, and reached for the device that lay beside her field kit. A small, rectangular box made of stamped metal, hardly larger than a cigarette case, with a plunger mechanism and a glass vial visible through a window in its side. To the German soldiers who would later capture dozens of these devices from overrun American positions, it looked like nothing more than a toy, a crude piece of stamped tin that seemed barely functional. But in that moment, as the nurse loaded it with a precious vial of penicillin and pressed it against the soldier's arm, it represented something that would transform battlefield medicine and save hundreds of lives in the coming weeks. The American Syrette injector, mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands, distributed to every medical unit in the U.S. Army, a technological marvel disguised as disposable simplicity. By mid-December 1944, the war in Western Europe had taken on a deceptive rhythm that suggested inevitable Allied victory was simply a matter of time. American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of Normandy in August, liberated Paris, swept across France, and were now positioned along Germany's western frontier, preparing for the final push into the Reich itself. The German army appeared to be in terminal decline, its forces retreating, its supply lines collapsing, its capacity for sustained resistance seemingly exhausted. Allied commanders were making plans for occupation, discussing post-war arrangements, calculating when the war might end. Then, on the morning of December 16th, in the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, Germany launched its last major offensive of the war. 200,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, attacked along an 85-kilometer front held by thinly spread American divisions. The offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, achieved complete tactical surprise. Within hours, German forces had penetrated deep into American lines, encircling units, capturing supply depots, and creating chaos in the Allied rear areas. Within days, the situation had become the gravest crisis faced by American forces in the European theater, threatening to split the Allied armies and potentially force a negotiated settlement that would prolong the war for months or years. For the American Medical Corps, the doctors, nurses, medics, and support personnel responsible for treating casualties, the offensive created an immediate catastrophe. Field hospitals that had been positioned to handle routine casualties from a static front suddenly found themselves in the path of advancing German armor. Some hospitals were evacuated in desperate scrambles, leaving behind equipment and supplies. Others were overrun, their personnel captured, their wounded patients falling into German hands. The 67th Evacuation Hospital, positioned near the town of Malmedy, received orders to evacuate on December 17th, just 24 hours after the offensive began. The staff had 2 hours to load critical patients into ambulances and trucks, to pack essential equipment, to destroy records that might compromise security, and to retreat west before German forces arrived. They left behind tents, surgical equipment, thousands of bandages and medical supplies, and, most critically, nearly their entire stock of the new wonder drug that had revolutionized battlefield medicine, penicillin. The loss was staggering, not just in material terms, but in lives that would be lost without access to the antibiotic that could prevent wound infections from becoming fatal. The German soldiers who captured the abandoned American field hospital positions in the first days of the offensive moved through them with a mixture of tactical urgency and growing amazement. Wehrmacht medical officers, desperate for supplies after years of blockade and bombing, had crippled German pharmaceutical production, inventoried what the Americans had left behind, and found abundance that defied their understanding of wartime logistics. There were surgical kits with complete instrument sets, each tool precisely machined and sterilized. There were plasma supplies in quantities that German hospitals could only dream of. There were morphine syrettes by the hundreds, small tubes of pain relief that could be administered by anyone, anywhere, without training or equipment. There were bandages, antiseptics, splints, and medications in varieties and quantities that suggested an industrial base operating at levels the Germans could no longer match. And there were the penicillin injectors, small, simple devices that looked almost crude in their construction, stamped metal boxes with basic plunger mechanisms, each one designed to hold a single vial of the antibiotic and deliver it through a needle that could be affixed in seconds. One German medical officer, in a report captured later in the war, described the American Syrette injectors as typical American engineering. Wasteful, crude, designed for mass production rather than quality, the kind of disposable tool a wealthy nation builds when it has more industrial capacity than sense. He noted that German medical syringes were precision instruments, reusable, carefully maintained, far superior in craftsmanship. He failed to grasp that the American crudeness was the point, that disposability was a feature rather than a flaw, that an army that could afford to throw away syringes after single use was an army that had already won the industrial war. The nurses who used these devices understood what the German medical officer did not, that the Syrette injector's genius lay not in its construction, but in its deployment. Before the Syrette system was introduced in 1943, administering drugs in field conditions required carrying glass syringes, metal needles, and vials of medication, all of which had to be kept sterile, all of which required training to use properly, all of which were fragile and could be lost or broken. A medic treating wounded men under fire had to carry multiple pieces of equipment, had to prepare injections while taking cover, had to work with hands that might be shaking from adrenaline or cold. The Syrette changed this completely. Each Syrette was a self-contained unit. The drug was preloaded, the needle was sterile and protected until use, the dosage was standardized, and the entire device could be used with minimal training. A medic could carry a dozen morphine syrettes in a pocket, could administer them in seconds with one hand, could mark each use by pinning the empty syrette to the patient's collar, so that follow-up medical personnel would know what had been given. The penicillin syrette worked on the same principle: a single dose, preloaded, ready to use, disposable. This meant that life-saving antibiotics could be administered at the point of injury, within minutes of wounding, by personnel who were not doctors or nurses, but combat medics or even fellow soldiers. The drug that in 1940 had been a laboratory curiosity was by 1944 being delivered to wounded men in foxholes and forest clearings by 20-year-old medics who had learned to use the Syrette system in a few hours of training. The German Army's medical system operated on entirely different principles, shaped by different assumptions about resources, training, and the nature of warfare. German military medicine was highly centralized and professionalized. Wounded soldiers were expected to be transported to rear-area hospitals where skilled doctors using proper equipment would provide treatment. The German Medical Corps emphasized quality over quantity, expertise over accessibility. A German military surgeon was likely to be better trained and more experienced than his American counterpart, operating with instruments that were beautifully engineered and maintained. But this system required infrastructure: hospitals, transportation, supply lines, time. When those elements were present, German military medicine was excellent. When they were absent, as they increasingly were by late 1944, the system collapsed. German medics in the field carried basic supplies, bandages, morphine in glass ampules that required syringes to administer, some sulfa drugs. They did not carry penicillin because Germany had never managed to produce it in meaningful quantities. They did not have disposable injectors because German industrial philosophy emphasized reusability and craftsmanship. They operated according to doctrine developed when Germany controlled Europe and could evacuate wounded to hospitals in Berlin or Munich. By December 1944, that doctrine was obsolete, but the system remained unchanged, producing a growing gap between medical needs and medical capacity. When the Ardennes offensive stalled in late December, when American reinforcements arrived and German forces began to run short of fuel and ammunition, when the weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to resume operations, the balance shifted rapidly. German units that had advanced deep into Allied territory found themselves cut off, surrounded, or forced to retreat. The wounded accumulated. German field hospitals, already overwhelmed, received casualties faster than they could treat them. And the American Medical Corps, having evacuated west and regrouped, began the process of returning, establishing new field hospitals and treating the flood of casualties from both sides. It was in this period, from late December 1944 through January 1945, that the American Surete system demonstrated its full value in circumstances that German medical officers observed with growing comprehension and despair. The 47th Field Hospital, attached to the 101st Airborne Division defending the surrounded town of Bastogne, operated throughout the siege under conditions that should have made organized medicine impossible. The hospital was established in a bombed-out barracks building with no heat, no running water, and no electricity except what could be generated by a portable generator that ran intermittently when fuel was available. Supplies had to be delivered by airdrop, meaning that requisitions were often filled incorrectly, or not at all, and that every item had to be carefully rationed. The hospital had 4 doctors, 12 nurses, and approximately 30 enlisted medics and support personnel. Between December 19th and December 26th, when the siege was broken, this small facility treated over 800 casualties, American, German, and Belgian civilian. Under normal circumstances, such numbers would have been impossible. The hospital lacked surgical capacity for more than a fraction of the cases. Many wounded men would have died from infection even if their initial injuries were survivable. But the hospital had one critical advantage: an adequate supply of penicillin syrettes. The chief nurse, a Captain Margaret Bellamy from Pennsylvania, kept a diary during the siege that was later deposited in Army medical archives. Her entries from late December describe a situation of controlled chaos where triage decisions were made in seconds, where surgery was performed by flashlight when the generator failed, where plasma was thawed by body heat because there was no other warming method available. But she returns repeatedly to the penicillin, noting its administration with an almost religious reverence. On December 22nd, she wrote, "Gave penicillin to 38 patients today. Most have penetrating wounds that in the last war would have meant gangrene and death. With the penicillin, we can stabilize them, prevent infection from taking hold, keep them alive until they can be evacuated. The Surete makes it possible to treat everyone quickly. Each injection takes perhaps 30 seconds. The men don't even feel it through their shock and pain. But it means they'll live. How do you calculate the value of 38 lives saved by a box of small metal tubes?" Her question was rhetorical, but it pointed to a transformation in military medicine that was occurring in real time. The shift from medicine as a craft practiced by skilled individuals to medicine as a system deployed at industrial scale. The German prisoners who were brought to the American field hospitals in Bastogne and treated alongside American casualties experienced a cognitive dissonance that reports and interrogations captured in striking detail. These men, Many of them veterans who had fought in Russia and North Africa, had been told since 1942 that Germany was losing the medical war, that Allied access to penicillin gave them an insurmountable advantage in treating wounded soldiers, that the drug was worth more than gold. They had expected that if captured and wounded, they would be treated by American doctors with equipment and drugs unavailable to German medicine. What they didn't expect was the scale and systematization of that treatment. One German sergeant, wounded in the abdomen by shell fragments and captured on December 23rd, told his interrogator that the most shocking aspect of his treatment was not the penicillin itself, but the casual efficiency with which it was administered. An American nurse had approached his litter, had examined his wounds quickly, had pulled a small metal device from her pocket, had pressed it against his arm, and had moved on to the next patient. The entire interaction had taken perhaps 90 seconds. No consultation, no deliberation, no sense that she was administering something precious. The sergeant said he realized in that moment that America had so much penicillin that it could be given to enemy prisoners by nurses who carried it in their pockets, like cigarettes. He said he understood then that Germany had lost not just the battle but the war, that the material disparity was so vast that no amount of courage or tactical skill could bridge it. This realization was repeated across hundreds of German prisoners who received medical treatment in American facilities during and after the Ardennes offensive. The penicillin itself was miraculous. Many had wounds that would have been fatal without it, and they knew this because they had seen comrades die of infected wounds that looked less serious than their own injuries. But the systematic nature of American medicine was perhaps even more psychologically impactful. The Americans treated medicine like logistics, like ammunition supply or vehicle maintenance. There were protocols, checklists, standardized procedures. The Surette was part of that system. A standardized dosage, a standardized administration method, a standardized documentation process. Every wounded man received the same evaluation, the same triage priority assignment, the same sequence of treatments. This wasn't because American doctors were more compassionate than German doctors, though many German prisoners commented on what they perceived as American humanitarian attitudes. It was because American military doctrine had systematized compassion, had turned mercy into a reproducible process supported by industrial logistics. The German military had excellent individual doctors who made brilliant decisions in difficult circumstances. The American military had a system that ensured adequate decisions were made consistently by personnel at every level, supported by supplies that never seemed to run out. The symbolic weight of the Surette extended beyond its immediate medical function. For American medical personnel, it became a tangible representation of what they were fighting for. Not just national survival or territorial integrity, but a vision of society where abundance enabled compassion, where industrial capacity translated into saved lives, where ordinary people armed with simple tools could accomplish what had previously required experts with complex equipment. The Surette was democratic in its design philosophy. It assumed that medics and nurses and even ordinary soldiers could learn to use it, that medical treatment didn't have to be restricted to an elite cadre of trained physicians. This philosophy was fundamentally American, rooted in the same cultural assumptions that valued mass education over elite schooling, mass production over artisan craftsmanship, standardization over customization. The Germans, products of a different tradition, found this philosophy both impressive and vaguely disturbing. A culture that mass-produced medical devices and then threw them away, that trained teenagers to administer powerful drugs, that systematized life-saving treatment to the point where it resembled an assembly line. Such a culture was powerful beyond measure, but it also represented something alien to European traditions of professional expertise and hierarchical organization. By January 1945, as the Ardennes offensive collapsed completely and German forces retreated back toward the Siegfried Line, American medical units were treating casualties at a rate that would have been impossible even 2 years earlier. The improvements were cumulative. Better training for medics, better organization of evacuation routes, better surgical techniques, and above all, better drugs administered more effectively. Penicillin alone is estimated to have reduced the mortality rate from infected wounds by over 80% compared to World War I. The Surette delivery system meant that the drug could be administered within the golden hour after injury, the critical period when treatment was most effective. The combination of drug and delivery mechanism saved thousands of lives, prevented tens of thousands of amputations, and returned thousands of soldiers to duty who in previous wars would have been permanently disabled or dead. These were not abstract statistics to the nurses and medics who administered the treatments. They were individual men with names and faces and stories, men who lived because a simple metal device allowed a nurse to inject penicillin in 30 seconds while standing in a freezing tent behind lines that might be overrun within hours. The German medical officers who examined captured American medical equipment in detail during the winter of 1944-45, produced reports that oscillated between technical admiration and philosophical rejection. They acknowledged that American mass production methods had achieved results that German precision engineering could not match. They recognized that the Surette system was more effective in field conditions than reusable syringes. They understood that American medical logistics were superior in every measurable way, but they struggled to accept the implications of these facts. One report, written by a German army doctor and captured in April 1945, analyzed the American Surette and concluded that while it was technically effective, it represented a philosophically impoverished approach to medicine that prioritizes convenience over craftsmanship, waste over conservation, and mechanical efficiency over professional judgment. The doctor noted that a properly trained German medic using traditional equipment could achieve the same results as an American using a Surette, and that the American reliance on disposable devices suggested a culture that had lost touch with the traditional values of medical practice. What the doctor failed to understand or refused to acknowledge was that the American system didn't need properly trained medics because it had systematized the knowledge that German medicine kept locked in professional expertise. An American teenager with 8 weeks of training could use a Surette effectively. A German medic required months or years of training to achieve equivalent results with traditional equipment. The American system scaled. The German system didn't. This scalability was the key difference between the two medical philosophies, and it reflected deeper differences in how the two nations approached industrial warfare. Germany, even in total war, maintained professional distinctions and hierarchies. Doctors were doctors, medics were medics, soldiers were soldiers, and each group had specific training and specific roles. The American military, drawing on a culture of improvisation and role flexibility, trained people to do multiple jobs and created tools that could be used by anyone. A combat infantryman could use a morphine Surette on a wounded comrade. A truck driver could administer penicillin if necessary. A nurse could perform tasks that in German hospitals would have required a doctor. This flexibility meant that the American military medical system degraded gracefully under pressure. When specialized personnel were unavailable, less specialized personnel could step in and maintain basic functions. The German system, by contrast, collapsed when key personnel were lost. Without trained doctors, German wounded went untreated. Without proper equipment, German medics couldn't function effectively. The system was excellent at its peak, but fragile under stress. The 300 wounded men who were saved by American nurses using Surette injectors during the Battle of the Bulge. The number is an estimate from field hospital records, and the actual figure was certainly higher, represented a cross-section of the armies fighting in the Ardennes that winter. They were American infantrymen and tankers, German prisoners, Belgian civilians, British paratroopers, and French resistance fighters. They were 18-year-old conscripts and 40-year-old veterans. They were men who believed in their causes and men who had stopped believing in anything except survival. What united them was vulnerability, the leveling experience of being wounded and dependent on others for life itself. And what saved them was a system that treated them as production units in a logistics pipeline rather than as individuals requiring bespoke care. This sounds callous, but it was actually merciful. The individualized, expert-driven medicine that the Germans practiced was excellent for patients who could reach hospitals and receive attention from skilled doctors. The systematized, protocol-driven medicine that the Americans practiced was adequate for everyone, regardless of where they were wounded or who was available to treat them. In total war, adequate care for everyone saves more lives than excellent care for the lucky few. The transformation in perception that occurred among German medical personnel who observed or experienced American battlefield medicine was part of a broader psychological shift that characterized the war's final months. German soldiers and civilians had been told since 1939 that they were fighting for cultural and racial survival against enemies who were either subhuman Bolsheviks or decadent Anglo-Americans. The propaganda had painted a picture of a world where German discipline, German efficiency, and German cultural superiority would triumph over quantity and industrial brute force. By early 1945, this narrative was collapsing under the weight of observable reality. The Americans were not decadent, they were frighteningly competent. Their industrial capacity was not a sign of cultural shallowness, but of organizational genius. Their democracy was not weakness, but a source of resilience. And their treatment of wounded enemies with the same penicillin and care that they gave their own soldiers suggested a moral confidence that was more disturbing to German observers than hatred or revenge would have been. It suggested that the Americans had already won, not just militarily, but philosophically, that they represented a future that Germany could not match or counter. This psychological defeat was as important as military defeat in determining the post-war order. German soldiers who surrendered in the West in early 1945 were surrendering not just to superior force, but to a superior system. And they knew it. They had seen the abundance of American supplies, the effectiveness of American medicine, the casual competence of American logistics. They had compared this to their own experience of shortages, breakdown, and improvisational desperation. And they had drawn conclusions about which system was more sustainable, which ideology could deliver better outcomes, which nation deserved their loyalty in the post-war world that was already taking shape. The Surete was a small part of this larger realization, but it was a potent symbol because it represented the intersection of industrial capacity, medical science, and democratic values. It showed that American abundance was not just about having more tanks or more planes, but about having systems that worked better, that saved more lives, that treated people, even enemy prisoners, with a baseline of dignity and care. The nurses who used the Surete injectors during the Battle of the Bulge were not thinking about symbolism or philosophy. They were thinking about the wounded man in front of them, about the next patient in line, about whether supplies would last until the next airdrop or convoy arrived. But their work had philosophical implications that they might not have articulated but certainly understood on some level. They were proving that women could perform critical roles in combat zones, that nurses were not just support personnel, but essential components of military effectiveness. They were demonstrating that American industrial capacity could be mobilized for humanitarian purposes, that the same factories that built bombers could build medical devices that saved lives. They were showing that democracy didn't mean chaos or inefficiency, but rather a different kind of order, one based on systems rather than hierarchy, on standardization rather than elite expertise, on abundance rather than scarcity. After the war, many of these nurses returned to civilian life and rarely spoke about their experiences. The culture of the 1950s didn't particularly value women's war service, and the medical work they had done, the lives they had saved, the decisions they had made under impossible circumstances, was largely forgotten or minimized. But some kept diaries, wrote letters, preserved photographs and documents. And in later decades, as historians began to examine the role of women in World War II and the evolution of battlefield medicine, these sources revealed a story of competence and courage that had been hidden in plain sight. The nurses who saved 300 men with syringe, injectors, and the many thousands of other nurses who saved many thousands of other men with the same tools had been part of a quiet revolution in military medicine, a transformation that was technical and organizational, but also cultural and philosophical. The German soldiers, who called the syringe a toy, were not entirely wrong. It was simple, crude in construction, designed for disposal rather than durability. But they failed to grasp that these characteristics were precisely what made it revolutionary. A tool that could be produced by the millions, distributed freely, used by anyone, and thrown away after a single use, represented a fundamentally different approach to the problem of battlefield medicine than anything that had come before. It represented an American way of war that prioritized system effectiveness over individual excellence, that relied on abundance to overcome complexity, that trusted ordinary people to do extraordinary things when given the right tools. This approach was not inherently superior to the German emphasis on expertise and precision. Both philosophies had strengths and weaknesses, but in the context of total industrial warfare, the American approach scaled better, adapted faster, and ultimately proved more effective at saving lives and winning wars. By the spring of 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and began the final drive into Germany, the medical system that had been tested and refined in the Ardennes was operating at peak efficiency. Casualty rates were declining, not because fighting was less intense, but because more wounded men were surviving.